The moment a plane is forced to stop is never the beginning of the story. It is the moment every hidden decision finally demands an answer. Flight 417 had already pushed back from the gate when every cabin light flickered once. The engines settled into an uneasy silence, and the captain's calm voice was interrupted by a message no frequent traveler ever expected to hear. Flight 417, shut down both engines immediately. This aircraft is under a federal security hold. Conversations disappeared as if someone had lowered an invisible curtain across the cabin. Business executives glanced up from laptops. Families stopped whispering. Even the flight attendants froze for the briefest second before exchanging confused looks. Outside the windows, flashing blue and white emergency lights reflected across the polished aluminum wing, while several TSA vehicles rolled toward the aircraft with deliberate precision. No one understood why an ordinary domestic flight had suddenly become the center of a federal security operation. In Seat 2B, Thomas Whitaker leaned toward the window, his confidence fading as he counted vehicle after vehicle surrounding the airplane. Only 15 minutes earlier, he had watched a black woman escorted away from the first-class cabin, convinced the problem had been solved before takeoff. Now the aircraft itself had become the problem. Near the front boarding door, Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood perfectly still, his expression no longer carrying the certainty that had filled his voice only moments before. A few feet away, Naomi Carter adjusted the sleeve of her navy blazer with remarkable calm, as though the flashing lights outside belonged to someone else's story. She looked at Mercer without anger, without satisfaction, and without raising her voice. "I told you not to close that door," she said quietly. The words landed with far more weight than a shout ever could. Mercer opened his mouth as if preparing another command, but nothing came. Around them, airport personnel moved with disciplined urgency, while radios crackled with instructions nobody inside the cabin could fully understand. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, each silently trying to guess who Naomi Carter really was. Some assumed she must be an attorney. Others imagined she knew a senator or a celebrity. A few wondered whether she had uncovered some dangerous threat. None of them realized the truth was both simpler and more unsettling. Sometimes one wrong decision does not expose a powerful person. Sometimes it exposes a broken system. The cabin remained silent except for the distant hum of idling engines and the muffled voices outside. Every second felt longer than the last. Thomas replayed the afternoon in his mind, searching for the exact moment everything had gone sideways. It had seemed so ordinary then. A woman sitting in first class. A suspicious glance. A quiet complaint. A police officer stepping aboard with complete confidence. No one had imagined those few ordinary moments would leave an entire airplane stranded on the tarmac under federal authority. To understand why every passenger was now waiting behind sealed doors, you have to go back exactly 12 minutes, to the instant Naomi Carter walked on a flight 417, carrying nothing more noticeable than a black leather briefcase, a boarding pass, and the kind of quiet confidence that almost everyone mistakes for belonging to someone with absolutely nothing to prove. Naomi Carter stepped through the aircraft door with the quiet confidence of someone who had traveled often enough to know that the loudest person in the room rarely noticed the most important details. A flight attendant greeted her with a professional smile, scanned her boarding pass, and directed her toward Seat 2 Alpha without hesitation. The first-class cabin carried its familiar atmosphere of polished leather, warm lighting, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee drifting from the galley. Passengers settled into oversized seats while laptops opened, newspapers unfolded, and soft conversations blended with the steady sounds of boarding. Naomi placed a black leather briefcase beneath the seat in front of her, folded her navy blazer neatly across her lap for a moment, then looked toward the boarding door instead of reaching for the welcome drink offered by the cabin crew. Her attention lingered on details that almost everyone else ignored. A service employee paused for several seconds beside the jet bridge entrance before entering a restricted doorway. Another airport worker used an identification badge, hesitated, then quickly disappeared from view. A baggage cart stopped unexpectedly outside the aircraft before continuing again. None of it appeared dramatic by itself. Yet Naomi quietly glanced at the slim watch on her wrist and committed each moment to memory. Across the aisle, Claire Donovan noticed Naomi observing the activity outside but assumed she was simply an experienced traveler passing the time before departure. She smiled politely and asked whether everything was comfortable. Naomi returned the smile. "Everything looks fine so far," she answered calmly. "Thank you." Claire nodded and continued greeting the remaining passengers. A few moments later, Thomas Whitaker entered the cabin carrying an expensive briefcase and speaking into a wireless headset about an investment meeting waiting for him in Dallas. He stopped beside seat 2 Bravo, looked at Naomi, then looked again at the seat numbers as though expecting to discover some kind of mistake. His expression remained courteous, but his eyes revealed unmistakable doubt. After placing his luggage in the overhead compartment, he leaned toward Claire as she walked by. "Excuse me," he asked quietly. "Could you double-check the seating assignment here? I just want to make sure everything is correct." Claire glanced at the boarding manifest on her handheld device and immediately smiled. "Everything is exactly as it should be, sir. Seat 2 Alpha belongs to Miss Carter." Thomas forced a polite smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "Interesting," he replied before taking his seat. Naomi heard every word but kept reading the airport safety card resting inside the seat pocket. She had spent years learning that silence often revealed more about other people than arguments ever could. Around them, more passengers settled into first class while the boarding process continued without interruption. Outside, another employee hurried across the ramp carrying paperwork that seemed to arrive several minutes later than expected. Naomi noticed the delay, checked her watch once more, then quietly closed the safety card. Her attention never wandered from the steady rhythm of the airport around her. She was not watching because she was anxious about flying. She was watching because patterns always mattered, and sometimes the smallest inconsistency became the first thread that unraveled a much larger story. Within minutes, one ordinary assumption inside this peaceful cabin would begin setting every remaining event into motion. The final passengers continued filing into the cabin as the boarding announcement echoed faintly through the open aircraft door, and the calm rhythm of travel seemed untouched by anything unusual. Naomi Carter remained seated with her hands resting lightly on the armrests, watching reflections move across the cabin windows instead of looking at the people around her. Every few seconds her eyes returned to the front galley, the boarding door, and the narrow stretch of jet bridge just outside. She noticed another airport employee carrying a sealed document envelope toward the gate counter before abruptly changing direction after exchanging a few hurried words with someone wearing a reflective safety vest. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, yet both employees walked away noticeably faster than before. Naomi quietly memorized the time without writing anything down. Across the aisle, Thomas Whitaker reached into his leather briefcase to retrieve a large white document envelope containing confidential paperwork for an upcoming business presentation. His telephone rang, and he answered while balancing the envelope beside him. During the conversation, he stood briefly to place another folder into the overhead compartment. In the distraction of ending the call and greeting another colleague who had boarded farther back, he absent-mindedly slid the envelope behind the seat pocket instead of returning it to his briefcase. He sat down without realizing what he had done. Several minutes passed before he reached for the envelope again. His hand searched once, then twice, before his expression slowly tightened. He checked his briefcase carefully, looked beneath his seat, then searched the overhead compartment with growing impatience. Nothing. He looked toward Naomi, whose black leather briefcase remained closed beneath the seat in front of her exactly where she had placed it. His attention lingered just a second too long. Instead of asking himself where he had last handled the envelope, his mind quietly searched for someone else to blame. He pressed the flight attendant call button. Claire Donovan arrived with her usual professional smile. Thomas lowered his voice, but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing every word. "I cannot find an important envelope that was right here a few minutes ago," he explained. "The only person near me has been sitting beside me since I boarded." Claire glanced toward Naomi before immediately looking back at Thomas. "Are you certain it was here when you sat down?" she asked gently. Thomas hesitated. "I believe so." It was not an accusation supported by evidence. It was an assumption supported by certainty. Claire turned toward Naomi with an apologetic expression. "Miss Carter, would you mind if I asked whether you happened to notice a white document envelope?" Naomi looked up calmly. "I noticed him speaking on the telephone, Placing luggage in the overhead bin and organizing his briefcase, she answered evenly. I did not see any envelope after that. Thomas folded his arms. That is convenient. Naomi met his eyes without changing her expression. Facts are often convenient because they do not change. The temperature inside the conversation shifted immediately. Nearby passengers who had been reading quietly now listened without pretending otherwise. One traveler removed an earbud. Another lowered a magazine. Claire sensed the growing tension and attempted to keep her voice reassuring. I am sure this is simply a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings often become something far more dangerous when assumptions begin replacing evidence. Thomas looked once more at Naomi before speaking words that caused several heads to turn. Some people think buying a first-class ticket means they belong anywhere. The sentence hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him for a moment, then returned her attention to the boarding door, as though something beyond the aircraft mattered far more than the judgment sitting one seat away. That quiet restraint would soon be mistaken for weakness, and the next decision made inside that cabin would change every life on board before the airplane ever left the ground. Claire Donovan felt every pair of eyes in the first-class cabin waiting for her next decision. Years of experience had taught her that most disagreements disappeared with patience, courtesy, and a few careful questions. This situation felt different. Before she could respond, a message appeared on her handheld device requesting airport security assistance after a passenger reported possible missing property. Claire hesitated for only a moment before acknowledging the notification. Naomi Carter remained perfectly composed, her attention briefly returning to the boarding door where another ground employee hurried past the aircraft windows carrying a clipboard. She quietly noted the exact time once again. Less than 2 minutes later, the sound of measured footsteps echoed through the jet bridge. Sergeant Daniel Mercer stepped onto the aircraft with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking control the moment he entered a room. His neatly pressed uniform, polished badge, and calm expression immediately drew the attention of every passenger nearby. Claire greeted him and quietly summarized the complaint, carefully mentioning that no missing property had been found and that no evidence had been presented. Mercer listened without asking a single follow-up question. Instead, his eyes settled almost immediately on Naomi. Thomas Whitaker pointed subtly in her direction before folding his arms with visible certainty. Mercer walked forward until he stopped beside seat 2 Alpha. Good afternoon, ma'am, he said in a voice that sounded polite but carried the unmistakable expectation of obedience. I understand there has been an issue. I need you to step into the jet bridge so we can sort this out. Naomi looked up calmly. Officer, has any evidence been presented that connects me to this complaint? Mercer answered without hesitation. We are simply trying to resolve the situation. Naomi nodded slightly. Then perhaps the first step is determining whether a situation actually exists. Several nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Mercer remained standing over her. Please bring your bag with you. Naomi gently rested one hand on the black leather briefcase beneath the seat. May I ask whether I am being detained or whether this is a voluntary conversation? Mercer appeared mildly irritated by the question. I am asking you to cooperate. Naomi maintained the same steady tone. I always cooperate with lawful procedures. I simply want to understand which procedure we are following. The cabin became noticeably quieter. Claire recognized that Naomi had not refused anything. She had only asked for clarification. Thomas shifted impatiently in his seat. Why is this taking so long? He muttered loudly enough for others to hear. Mercer turned slightly toward him before facing Naomi again. If you have nothing to hide, this should be very simple. Naomi met his eyes without raising her voice. The absence of evidence should make it simple for everyone. Mercer studied her identification after she handed over her personal driver's license and boarding pass. Both were valid. The ticket clearly listed seat 2 Alpha. Even so, he handed them back without acknowledging that fact. His attention remained fixed on Naomi rather than on the unanswered questions surrounding the missing envelope. Then, in a sentence that caused the atmosphere inside the cabin to change instantly, Mercer said, "You people always have an explanation for everything." Silence swept across the rows of first class. Claire looked toward him with visible surprise. Thomas lowered his gaze for only a second before saying nothing at all. Naomi did not react with anger. She simply looked directly at the officer and asked in a calm, unmistakably clear voice, "Officer Mercer, what exactly do you mean when you say, 'you people'?" No one spoke. The question lingered in the quiet cabin, and for the first time since boarding began, the conversation was no longer about a missing envelope. It had become a test of judgment, character, and the choices that every witness would make next. For several long seconds, Sergeant Daniel Mercer said nothing. The question remained suspended in the quiet cabin while every passenger waited to hear how he would answer it. Instead of explaining his words, he straightened his shoulders and shifted the conversation back toward authority. "This discussion is over," he said evenly. "I am asking you to leave the aircraft while we complete our investigation." Naomi Carter held his gaze without the slightest sign of fear or frustration. "Officer Mercer, I have already provided valid identification and a valid boarding pass. No evidence has connected me to the missing document. Before I leave my assigned seat, I would appreciate knowing the legal basis for removing me from this flight." Mercer glanced briefly toward Thomas Whitaker, whose confident expression suggested he expected the conversation to end in his favor. Claire Donovan quietly looked from one person to the other, hoping someone would simply locate the missing envelope and end the growing tension. Instead, Mercer made another decision. "Bring your briefcase," he instructed. Naomi rested one hand on the black leather case beneath the seat. "This case contains confidential work materials," she replied calmly. "If there is a lawful request to inspect it, I will follow the proper procedure." Mercer extended his hand toward the handle. "I do not need another explanation. I need your cooperation." Naomi slowly stood without resistance, lifting the briefcase herself before he could touch it. As she rose, the aircraft shifted slightly while cargo loading continued outside. The briefcase gently brushed against the armrest, causing one of its metal latches to release with a soft click. The lid opened less than an inch before Naomi immediately secured it again. Even in that brief moment, Mercer noticed only the corner of a neatly organized folder marked with a bold red security stripe. He did not pause to ask why an ordinary traveler carried documents sealed in that manner. He simply assumed they were irrelevant. Naomi calmly locked the latch again and looked toward the front of the aircraft. Through the open boarding door, she caught another glimpse of the ramp outside. A baggage cart remained stopped in an unusual position, and one untagged suitcase still sat several yards away from the loading equipment. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before she returned her attention to Mercer. "Officer," she said quietly, "I strongly recommend that this aircraft remain at the gate until every security procedure has been verified." Mercer gave a short, dismissive smile. "That decision is above your pay grade." Naomi answered with the same steady voice she had used from the beginning. "This is not about my pay grade. It is about preventing a mistake that becomes much harder to correct later." Thomas released a quiet laugh under his breath. To him, Naomi sounded like someone trying to delay the inevitable. Several passengers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncertain looks but remained silent. Claire noticed the concern in Naomi's expression and, for the first time, wondered whether the warning was genuine. She almost asked Mercer to slow down and verify the situation once more. Almost. But schedules mattered. Departures were already running behind. No one wanted to delay an entire flight because of a disagreement that appeared, at least on the surface, to involve nothing more than a missing envelope. Mercer stepped aside and motioned toward the aircraft door. Naomi adjusted her blazer, picked up her briefcase, and began walking down the narrow aisle without protest. Every passenger watched in complete silence as she passed. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared openly. Naomi never looked at Thomas. She never argued with Mercer. Just before reaching the front door, she paused for a single moment and glanced once more toward the ramp outside. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "Once that cabin door closes, everything changes." Mercer answered confidently, "The only thing changing today is where this conversation takes place." Neither man nor woman sitting inside that aircraft realized that both statements were true, but only one of them understood what they actually meant. The cabin door closed with a firm mechanical sound that echoed through the front of the aircraft, and for the passengers still inside, it felt like the end of an uncomfortable interruption. Sergeant Daniel Mercer escorted Naomi Carter into a quiet airport security office just beyond the gate, where a plain conference table, 2 chairs, and a computer monitor waited beneath bright fluorescent lights. The room was clean, orderly, and almost completely silent. Mercer gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please have a seat." Naomi placed her black leather briefcase beside the table before sitting down without a word. Her calm never changed. She glanced once at the wall clock, then toward the narrow window overlooking the jet bridge. Every passing second appeared to matter to her far more than the conversation itself. Mercer removed a standard incident report from a folder and began entering information into the computer. "For the record," he said, "a passenger reported missing property after sitting near you. You questioned my instructions, and now we are documenting the situation." Naomi listened carefully before answering. "For the record, I asked what evidence connected me to the complaint. That question has not yet been answered." Mercer continued typing without looking up. "The report will reflect everything necessary." Naomi folded her hands on the table. "Reports become official records. Accuracy matters." The officer gave a brief smile that suggested complete confidence. "I know how reports work." Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, the atmosphere slowly relaxed. Flight attendants completed the final safety checks while passengers returned to conversations that had been interrupted only minutes earlier. Thomas Whitaker leaned back in his seat with visible satisfaction, convinced the inconvenience had finally ended. As he adjusted his jacket, something white caught the corner of his eye. Wedged between the side of his seat cushion and the magazine pocket was the large document envelope he had been searching for. He quietly pulled it free and stared at it for a moment. The envelope had never left his seat. No one had taken it. No one had touched it. He looked toward the front of the cabin where Naomi had disappeared only moments before. For an instant, guilt crossed his face. Claire Donovan noticed the envelope immediately. Their eyes met across the aisle. Neither of them needed to say a word to understand exactly what had happened. Claire stepped closer and spoke softly. "Sir, was that the envelope?" Thomas hesitated before answering. "Yes." She waited for him to continue. He never did. Instead, he slipped the envelope back into his briefcase, looked toward the window, and quietly said, "There is no reason to complicate things now." Claire felt her stomach tighten. She knew the misunderstanding had just become something far more serious because it was no longer a misunderstanding. It had become a choice. She glanced toward the closed aircraft door, considering whether she should contact the gate immediately. At that exact moment, the captain announced that departure preparations were complete. Outside, the pushback tug slowly moved into position beneath the aircraft nose. Back inside the security office, Mercer finished typing the final sentence of his report. Without reviewing it aloud, he pressed the key that transmitted the document into the airport reporting system. Naomi watched the confirmation message appear on the monitor. Her expression remained unchanged. "Officer Mercer," she said quietly, "are you certain you want that report submitted exactly as written?" Mercer leaned back with complete confidence. "Absolutely." Naomi nodded once, almost sympathetically. "Then I sincerely hope every statement in it can withstand the same level of scrutiny that the truth always does." Mercer dismissed the comment as nothing more than another attempt to sound important. Outside the office window, the aircraft slowly began moving away from the gate. While somewhere deep inside a secure federal network, a chain of events had already begun that neither Mercer nor anyone on board could see. And once it started, it would not stop until every unanswered question finally found its answer. The aircraft had barely rolled a few yards away from the gate when everything changed at once. Deep inside a secure federal monitoring network, the incident report Sergeant Daniel Mercer had submitted was automatically cross-referenced against active airport operations. Most reports disappeared into a database without attracting attention. This one did not. A single line identifying property temporarily retained during the investigation triggered an internal verification process. Seconds later, another alert appeared after a protected government communication device failed to respond to its scheduled encrypted authentication. Hundreds of yards away inside the Airport Operations Center, Marcus Reed looked up from a security briefing as a red notification flashed across his monitor. The message was short, direct, and impossible to ignore. Protected federal device compromised. User unavailable during active operational period. Reed immediately checked the assigned device identification number. His expression changed instantly. The device belonged to Deputy Federal Security Director Naomi Carter, who was conducting an unannounced operational assessment that morning. She had not checked in because she was not supposed to. The entire purpose of the inspection depended on no one knowing she was there. Reed attempted to establish secure contact. There was no response. He tried again. Silence. A second notification appeared before he could make another call. Surveillance logs showed that a suitcase loaded onto Flight 417 had bypassed one of the final verification checkpoints after a temporary access irregularity near the service corridor. By itself, the issue might have required additional review. Combined with the unexplained loss of communication from Carter, it became something far more serious. Reed stood immediately. "Stop that aircraft now," he ordered. Around the operations center, conversations ended as personnel turned toward their monitors. Controllers verified the aircraft location. The pushback had already begun, but the plane remained on the ramp. The command was transmitted without delay. "Maintain current position. Do not continue taxi operations. Federal security hold is now in effect." Outside, flashing emergency vehicles accelerated toward the aircraft with disciplined precision. Ground crews stepped aside as the convoy approached. Inside the cockpit, the captain received the unexpected instruction and immediately acknowledged it. Engines remained at idle while the aircraft came to a complete stop. Confused passengers looked through their windows as blue and white lights reflected across the wings. Back inside the security office, Naomi quietly heard distant radio traffic growing more urgent outside the closed door. She glanced once toward the window before returning her attention to Mercer, who remained completely unaware of what was unfolding beyond the room. His telephone vibrated on the table. He answered confidently. As he listened, the color slowly faded from his face. "Repeat that," he said. "The aircraft has been placed under an immediate federal security hold," the dispatcher answered. "Remain where you are. Senior federal personnel are responding." Mercer frowned. "For a missing document complaint?" The dispatcher paused. "Negative. We were only instructed to secure everyone involved and preserve all records." The call ended. Mercer looked toward Naomi, searching for an explanation she had never offered. She simply folded her hands once more. "Officer," she said with quiet composure, "I asked that the aircraft remain at the gate because there were questions that needed answers before anyone departed." Mercer stared at her. "Who exactly are you?" Naomi did not answer. Instead, she looked toward the office door as footsteps approached from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. The handle turned slowly, and before anyone inside the room spoke another word, the entire course of the day was about to change in a way that none of the passengers waiting inside the silent aircraft could possibly have imagined. The office door opened with quiet authority, and every conversation in the hallway stopped before it reached the room. 3 senior federal security officials entered without hesitation, followed by 2 airport operations supervisors carrying secure tablets. At the center of the group stood Marcus Reed. His eyes moved first to Naomi Carter, then to Sergeant Daniel Mercer, and finally to the incident report still displayed on the computer monitor. Reed took one measured step forward before speaking in a calm, unmistakably formal voice. "Deputy Federal Security Director Naomi Carter, I apologize for the delay." The room became completely silent. Mercer blinked once, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Reed continued without changing his expression. "We received notification that your protected communication device failed scheduled authentication during your operational inspection. We have secured the aircraft and initiated federal review procedures." Naomi rose from her chair with the same quiet composure she had shown since boarding the aircraft. "Thank you, Director Reed," she replied. "Please preserve every record connected to this incident before anything is altered." Reed nodded immediately. "Already done." Mercer looked from one official to another, struggling to understand how the passenger he had removed from the aircraft had suddenly become the person every federal official in the room appeared to recognize. "No one informed me," he finally said. Naomi answered before anyone else could. "That is because no one was supposed to." The inspection was unannounced. Reed placed a sealed folder on the table. "Deputy Director Carter has been conducting an independent operational assessment of airport security procedures, passenger treatment, and compliance with federal reporting standards." Mercer lowered his eyes toward the incident report still open on the screen. For the first time, He carefully reread the statements he had entered only minutes earlier. Reed continued, "The aircraft was not secured because of your interaction alone. During Deputy Director Carter's inspection, multiple procedural irregularities were identified before boarding was completed. One supervisor opened a tablet and displayed synchronized security footage. Cameras showed an employee entering a restricted service corridor using an identification credential assigned to another worker. Additional footage confirmed that one suitcase had advanced through the loading process before the final verification sequence had been completed. None of the issues represented an immediate threat after review, but every one of them required investigation before departure." Naomi looked toward the screen. "Those were the observations I intended to report before the aircraft left the gate." Reed nodded. "Instead, you were removed before completing your assessment." Another official quietly added, "The passenger complaint has also been resolved." A second tablet displayed a still image from inside the aircraft. Thomas Whitaker could clearly be seen retrieving the missing document envelope from the side of his own seat after Naomi had already left the cabin. Claire Donovan had confirmed the timeline in her written statement only moments earlier. No accusation against Naomi had ever been supported by evidence. Reed closed the tablet. Every available recording confirms Deputy Director Carter remained in her assigned seat throughout boarding. Mercer stood motionless. The confidence that had guided every earlier decision disappeared beneath the weight of documented facts. Naomi did not celebrate. She did not criticize him. Instead, she spoke with quiet disappointment. Authority is most valuable when it slows us down long enough to verify the truth. The moment authority replaces evidence with assumption, everyone becomes less safe. No one argued. Outside the office window, emergency vehicles remained positioned around the motionless aircraft while investigators preserved digital records, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed every step that had transformed an ordinary departure into a lesson that would reach far beyond a single airport gate. The federal review continued for more than an hour, but by the time the final verification was complete, every unanswered question had been replaced with documented facts. The suitcase that had triggered additional scrutiny was confirmed safe after inspectors completed the required verification process. The employee who had used another person's access credential was immediately removed from sensitive duties pending a formal investigation. Every digital record, surveillance video, and written statement was preserved exactly as it had existed before anyone had the opportunity to revise a single detail. Inside the first class cabin, passengers waited quietly as updates reached them, one careful announcement at a time. The earlier confidence that had filled the aircraft had disappeared, replaced by reflection. Thomas Whitaker remained seated with his document envelope resting silently inside his briefcase. He replayed every assumption he had made from the moment Naomi Carter walked onto the aircraft. The evidence had never supported his suspicion. His certainty had simply arrived long before the facts did. Claire Donovan stood near the front galley, thinking about the moment she had almost spoken up after seeing Thomas recover the missing envelope. She understood now that remaining silent had not preserved peace. It had only allowed an unfair conclusion to travel farther than the truth. A short time later, Naomi stepped back onto the aircraft after receiving clearance to continue her journey. The cabin became completely quiet. No announcement introduced her. No one applauded. The silence itself carried far more meaning than words could have expressed. Claire approached first. "Miss Carter," she said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. I knew something did not feel right, but I chose the easier path instead of the right one." Naomi smiled gently. "Doing the right thing is rarely easier in the moment," she answered, "but it always makes tomorrow easier to live with." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before thanking her. Thomas slowly stood as Naomi reached her seat. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I was wrong. I allowed my assumptions to become accusations, and I am sorry." Naomi looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the day. "I accept your apology," she replied. "I only hope the next person you meet never has to earn the fairness that should have been given from the beginning." Thomas nodded without attempting to defend himself. There was nothing left to explain. Sergeant Daniel Mercer remained outside the aircraft as other officials completed administrative procedures connected to the investigation. No dramatic confrontation followed. The official records, witness statements, and video evidence would speak for themselves. Accountability would come through the process designed to protect both the public and those entrusted with authority. Naomi returned to seat 2 Alpha and placed her briefcase beneath the seat exactly where it had rested before the entire chain of events had begun. As passengers settled back into their seats, the captain announced that the aircraft had been cleared for departure. This time, no one seemed impatient about the delay. Many understood that arriving a little later was a small price to pay for making certain the right decisions had been made. As the airplane finally taxied toward the runway, Naomi looked out the window at the airport slowly disappearing behind them. She knew most people would remember the flashing lights, the unexpected delay, or the federal investigation. She hoped they would remember something far more important. Titles may reveal authority, but they should never determine who deserves respect. Evidence should always arrive before judgment, and dignity should never depend on who someone turns out to be. Because the strongest badge is not the one worn on a uniform. It is the character that chooses truth when assumptions would have been easier.